counterterrorism, and on cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and innovation will be in order. Subcommittees are meeting today on a whole-of-government approach to combating ransomware, examining DHS's role. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittees in recess at any point. Good morning. I'd like to thank our witnesses from the Department of Homeland Security for joining us today to discuss DHS's role in our efforts to combat ransomware. I also want to recognize Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Members Pfluger and Garbarino, as well as Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Katko, who I believe are on or coming on. In the spirit of getting to the meat of the conversation, I'm going to encourage my fellow members of Congress to shorten their opening statements so that we can get right to it. And I appreciate your flexibility for our witnesses on knowing that we have many, many hearings going on right now, many folks, including Chairwoman Clark, in and out of an important markup. And so we appreciate your understanding. I will just say that I think ransomware is one of those rare national security issues where you can have high-level policy debate in Washington that directly connects to the tangible impacts on people's lives back home in places like Michigan and in Texas. We know that ransomware attacks have exploded in the United States, and during a year and a half where we've been more dependent than ever on digital technology, it's really hit home for certainly most of the citizens that I represent. These attacks are overwhelmingly carried out by foreign groups. So that means our constituents are victims of foreign attack. Ordinarily, it would not be average Americans who are, receiving a foreign attack. It'd be soldiers and tanks and planes who signed up to be on the front lines, not the average citizen. Colonial Pipeline and JBS Foods were certainly attacks that hit home very deeply. And I would just note that our schools, our K through 12 schools, are the places where I've been hearing constant concern from our superintendents because they've been particularly hard hit. I think we have 43 school districts in Michigan that have been hit by ransomware attacks, obviously deeply disruptive on top of a very disruptive year. And we know that Michigan State University, I represent, our universities have been paying ransoms to get back the data of the personal information affecting over 9,000 students. So it's not going away anytime soon. We know that it's extremely profitable, and we know that Secretary Mayorkas and Director Wray and countless others have made this a national security priority. I think what's important to us and important to expose for the American people is what are we doing about it? Please help our citizens understand and help the committee understand what DHS is doing to fight back with our citizens on the front lines. I'm pleased that we're strengthening what we're doing against ransomware. I'm glad that it's bipartisan. That's an extremely important thing. And we know that DHS is a key federal player in this whole conversation, particularly given your specific role of engaging with state and locals down in our states. People want to know where they go when they call 911, when they've got a ransomware attack. It's happening to their school, it's happening to their business, it's happening to their local government. Who do they call and how do they take care of it? With that, I'll recognize my partner on the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Representative Pfluger. Please, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Slotkin and Chairwoman Clark, also my ranking member colleague Garbarino, for holding this subcommittee hearing today, which I agree with everything that was said, that this is such an important time in this country to identify the issues, to come up with solutions, and to move forward. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today as well. This impacts every place in America, including my constituents who have recently been victims of these types of attacks. The United States right now, I think, faces an overwhelming threat from cybercrime, especially ransomware. And the attacks we've witnessed over the past year on the country's critical infrastructure put the livelihood, privacy, and our way of life, the way of life of everyday Americans, at risk. The criminals behind these attacks are emboldened not only by the large sums that they command for the ransoms, but also by the relative anonymity that they are able to maintain. Groups like Hafnium, Nobilium, REvil, those groups launch their attacks from safe havens in Russia and China, and they operate because of the blind eye and even encouragement that these countries offer. I was glad to see the Department of Justice's recent indictment of two foreign nationals charged with deploying REvil ransomware to attack businesses and government entities in the United States, and I look forward to hearing about the role that DHS played in that investigation as well. Arrests like these should serve as a warning to every cyber criminal that the United States will bring them to justice no matter where they are located. I, like my colleagues on this committee, am keenly interested in the preventative measures that American private and public sectors should be taking to mitigate these nefarious efforts of cyber criminals, from local school systems to pipelines that supply vital energy to our country. Across the country, these criminals have highlighted that everyone using modern technology is at risk, and we must all take measures to safeguard ourselves and our businesses. However, when these measures fail, it is up to members of our law enforcement and our legal communities to pursue and prosecute those responsible. When a cyber attack occurs, every minute counts. Time is of the essence, and criminal investigators, network security experts must work hand in glove to understand the technologies these criminals are using, as well as the specific vulnerabilities they are exploiting. As demonstrated by the panel before us, DHS has several components dedicated to combating cybercrime. I'm looking forward to hearing about the many ways that these components and offices work within the department, as well as with other agencies to combat this threat. DHS is doing an incredible job, and I commend them for their continued efforts. However, cyber criminals continue growing and evolving, and we must do the same to fully protect our own cyber networks. It is important for us to understand how law enforcement entities within DHS and across the spectrum of the federal government are working cohesively, and how that cooperative relationship works with the private entities, and how they cultivate these relationships to continue to ensure that America's privacy is prioritized. This is a new frontier in law enforcement, but I'm inspired by the work that's already being done. I'm also looking forward to hearing what our witnesses forecast as the future threat. We all understand that at present, the imminent actor is Russia, with China also playing a role. Within the Intel and Counterterrorism Subcommittee, it is important that we anticipate the upcoming risk. And the only way that we can properly equip ourselves with protection and mitigation is to understand the threat that is coming. To do that, we need to know what the cyber landscape will look like now, but also in 3 months, 6 months, and years from now. Madam Chair, thank you again for holding this hearing. I'm sincerely looking forward to hearing what the witnesses have to say and the direction that we need to go, and what role we can play in Congress to support your efforts and to keep America more secure. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pfluger. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation Subcommittee, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark, for an opening statement.
Good morning, everyone. And I want to thank Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Members Pfluger and Garbarino for collaborating on this important, timely hearing. I'd like to thank the panel of witnesses for joining us today. Earlier this year, as chair of our first hearing of this Congress on the ransomware pandemic, because I recognize what a serious challenge it poses to our national security. At that hearing, we heard from members of the Ransomware Task Force, the president of the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, and former CISA Director Chris Krebs about what actions the federal government must take to address this cybersecurity crisis. Just 2 days later, Colonial Pipeline reported it was shutting down 5,500 miles of pipeline as a precaution after being hit by a ransomware attack. Reports about ransomware attacks had been simmering for years, but they reached a boiling point overnight as gas shortages, excuse me, Madam Chair, I'm having a little technical difficulties here.
No problem. Madam Chair, we can hear you, but would you like us to circle back with you?
That would work a bit better. I'm sorry about that.
Of course, no problem, no problem. Welcome to the modern era here. The chair now recognizes the ranking member on the SIPI subcommittee, Mr. Garbarino, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Slotkin and Chairwoman Clark, for holding this important hearing, and my good friend and colleague from Texas, Mr. Pfluger. I appreciate the witnesses being here today to discuss the administration's holistic efforts to combat ransomware. Over the past several years, ransomware attacks have increased at an alarming rate. This year alone, we have witnessed the impact of devastating attacks on Colonial Pipeline, JBS Meats, and yet another school district on Long Island, where I'm from. Earlier this year, both the Bayshore and Lindenhurst school districts in my district were hit by cyber attacks. And it was recently reported that Manhasset School District on Long Island also experienced an attack in September. If the past year has taught us nothing else, it's that no entity is too small or too big to experience a ransomware attack. We all must stay vigilant to protect ourselves and our country. This summer, I was pleased to host a ransomware roundtable in my district with local schools, hospitals, small businesses, and government. CISA's Region 2 team explained how CISA can help mitigate these attacks. CISA's regional teams are the agency's secret weapon to fight this. CISA has the tools and capability necessary to bolster any entity's cyber defenses free of charge. I'm committed to continuing to work with the entities in New York's 2nd District and across the country to improve their cybersecurity posture in the wake of increasing threats. We must ensure DHS, particularly CISA, has the resources and capabilities to help entities do just that. It is also vital that the Secret Service has the authorities and resources to investigate ransomware attacks and illicit financing operations. The Secret Service's National Computer Forensics Institute provides cybercrime investigative training to state, local law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges. I look forward to hearing from the Secret Service how we can continue to leverage this critical training to bolster our defenses at the state and local level. Ransomware attacks have devastating real-world consequences for Americans. Every minute that a hospital goes down is a minute of missed critical care. This life-threatening risk poses similar concerns for almost every industry. We need to double down on ensuring state and local entities and small businesses adopt basic cybersecurity best practices to mitigate cyber risks. These practices can include two-factor authentication, strong passwords, retaining backups, developing a response plan, and updating software. I'm a proud original co-sponsor of the Chairwoman's State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which would establish a grant program for state and local entities to improve their cyber posture. While we know resources for our state and local governments are necessary to reduce the threat of cyber attacks, we must ensure these funds are spent responsibly and have a meaningful impact on risk reduction. CISA plays a vital role here. This important bill is a tremendous step forward in our fight, but we can't stop there. We must adopt an all-of-the-above approach to dealing with this challenge. There's no single silver bullet. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the innovative solutions Congress could consider as we work to degrade and ultimately eliminate the viability of ransomware. And lastly, I want to thank Brandon Wales for his leadership as acting director of CISA for nearly 8 extremely turbulent months. Mr. Wales, your work at the helm of this agency was tremendous benefit to our nation. Thank you. And thank you again to both chairs for bringing this important issue to hearing today.
Thanks. I believe we all second that. Madam Chairwoman, are we ready to go? Can I yield back to you?
We're ready to go.
Okay.
We're ready to go, Madam Chair. As I was stating, I held our first hearing of this Congress on ransomware epidemic because I recognize what a serious challenge it poses to our national security. And at that hearing, we heard from members of the Ransomware Task Force, the president of the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, and former CISA Director Chris Krebs about what actions the federal government must take to address this cybersecurity crisis. Just 2 days later, Colonial Pipeline reported it was shutting down 5,500 miles of pipeline as a precaution after being hit by a ransomware attack. Reports about ransomware attacks had been simmering for years, but they reached a boiling point overnight as gas shortages occurred across much of the East Coast. As spring wore on, we learned about ransomware attacks against JBS Foods, Kaseya, Brentag, and others. Fortunately, President Biden has made combating ransomware a top priority since taking office. At DHS, Secretary Mayorkas announced that ransomware would be the first of the department's 60-day cybersecurity sprints. And CISA has continued to lead the way in raising awareness about how to protect against ransomware, including by supporting stopransomware.gov, a website with resources for businesses and individuals with steps they can take to reduce their risk. But these actions are not limited to DHS. President Biden has committed to a whole of government approach that includes the Departments of State, Commerce, Justice, and Treasury, and the intelligence community. and the issue of ransomware has been a topic at high-level international meetings, both with our allies and with our adversaries, including Russia. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how DHS is leveraging the authorities and capabilities of its components to contribute to the administration's broader ransomware efforts. I'm also pleased that Congress is stepping up to provide the authorities and resources necessary to combat ransomware. In particular, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act signed into law by President Biden on Monday includes my legislation, the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act, providing $1 billion in cybersecurity preparedness grants to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Additionally, the package includes $100 million for a new cybersecurity response and recovery fund that will complement cybersecurity preparedness grants by providing state and local government victims with alternatives to making ransom payments. Together, these new resources will help make ransomware a higher cost and lower reward endeavor. And while I wish we had taken steps to enhance state and local cybersecurity earlier, I'm glad that with the support of President Biden and the Senate this year, we have finally stepped up as a partner with all levels of government to secure our critical public networks. Furthermore, after many years of debate in Congress, I am confident that we will finally enact mandatory cyber incident reporting legislation as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. As I work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this committee and in the Senate to finalize an agreement, I'm eager to hear our witnesses' perspectives on how greater information on cyber incidents and ransom payments would strengthen the administration's counter-ransomware efforts. It is my hope that greater information sharing in support of the administration's whole-of-government approach to combating ransomware will help improve our visibility into the ransomware epidemic and enhance our ability to respond appropriately. Again, I thank our witnesses for being here today. I thank my colleagues for convening this very important hearing, and I look forward to your testimony here today. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman. The Chair now recognizes the Chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Slotkin and Chairwoman Clark, for convening this hearing and for your leadership on this important issue. We're here today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's work as part of the Biden's administration's whole-of-government approach to countering ransomware. I'm particularly pleased that President Biden is harnessing capabilities across the federal government to prevent, respond, mitigate, and recover from ransomware attacks. Clearly, DHS is the agency that has the capabilities, and I believe they are uniquely positioned to help address the threats posed by ransomware as well as future attacks. I'm pleased that you're holding this hearing today, and I look forward to testimony from the witnesses between CISA, U.S. Secret Service, and other DHS partners to protect our communities and critical infrastructure from ransomware attack. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members are also reminded that the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member of the full committee in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. We got there, guys. We got there. Our first witness is Mr. Robert Silvers, the Undersecretary for Strategy, Policy, and Plans at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Silvers leads policy and implementation plans across all of DHS's missions. He previously served as DHS's Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy and as the department's Deputy Chief of Staff. Our second witness is Mr. Brandon Wales, the Executive Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Mr. Wales is CISA's Senior Career Executive and has served in the Department of Homeland Security for over 15 years, including, as was mentioned by Mr. Garbarino, the Acting CISA Director for many, many months. Thank you for that service, and DHS Chief of Staff. Finally, we have Mr. Jeremy Sheridan, the Assistant Director of the Office of Investigations at the U.S. Secret Service. Mr. Sheridan has served in numerous supervisory assignments in the field, at headquarters, and in protective divisions, including as the Deputy Assistant Director of the Office of Training, Deputy Assistant Director of the Office of Investigations, and Assistant Director of the Office of Intergovernmental and Legislative Affairs. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be included for the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his remarks for 5 minutes, beginning with Undersecretary Silvers.
Thank you, Chairwoman Slotkin, Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, Ranking Member Pfluger, and of course, Chairman Thompson as well as the other distinguished members. Thank you for inviting me here to testify today about ransomware. Today, I will explain the all-hands approach that this administration is taking to combat ransomware and to protect the American people. Ransomware attackers require victims to pay to regain access to critical data, to restore operations, and to prevent disclosure of sensitive information. The downstream effects can have national-level implications, as we saw when this country's gasoline supply was interrupted by the attack on Colonial Pipeline. But ransomware also hits directly into communities. It victimizes schools, hospitals, local government agencies, and small and medium-sized businesses. I agree with your comments, Chairwoman Slotkin, that this is an issue that impacts ordinary Americans. As the Undersecretary, I am responsible for developing our department's approach to preventing and mitigating ransomware and to disrupting its perpetrators. I do this together with my colleagues from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and from the U.S. Secret Service, who I'm pleased to be joined by today. I also do this together with other federal agency partners and with the private sector. DHS is spearheading much of the administration's effort to counter ransomware. First, we are building resilience across our critical infrastructure and private sector businesses. We are laser focused on helping organizations to harden their defenses. We are sharing ransomware threat information and network defense best practices. In March, Secretary Mayorkas ordered a 60-day cyber sprint on ransomware so that we could bolster the support that we can offer to our stakeholders. We have launched StopRansomware.gov, a one-stop shop to access federal guidance on ransomware protection, detection, and response. Second, we and our partners across the administration are being aggressive in disrupting ransomware actors. We are taking the fight to them. We are seizing their cryptocurrency, indicting them, sanctioning the financial platforms that they use, and taking other steps to disrupt the infrastructure that they use to commit their crimes. The Department of the Treasury, working with other agencies, has levied its first ever sanctions against virtual currency exchanges that are complicit in facilitating ransomware payments. These designations restrict the ability of ransomware actors to launder and move ransomware proceeds. The Department of Treasury has also sanctioned individuals associated with REvil, the ransomware syndicate behind the attack on JBS Foods and the IT services firm Kaseya. The Department of Justice has seized millions of dollars in cryptocurrency from the threat actors behind prominent attacks on Colonial Pipeline and Kaseya, amongst others. And the Secret Service investigates ransomware attacks and interdicts ransomware payments as part of its work on the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, where it leads the Criminal Mission Center. As our third line of effort, we are engaging with international partners to counter ransomware. In October, the White House hosted a counter-ransomware summit with over 30 countries. With our partners, we reinforce responsible norms of cyber activity, and we call out and confront those countries that undermine them. We share information to protect our critical infrastructure through CISA's CERT-to-CERT relationships around the world, and we collaborate on investigating and arresting cyber criminals wherever they operate. All of these efforts achieve results. The battle against ransomware is ongoing, and we are approaching it with resolve. We are taking an all-of-the-above approach, as you said, Chairman Garbarino, building up defenses at home, linking arms with our partner countries, and finding and rooting out the perpetrators, their infrastructure, and their money. I thank the subcommittees for holding a hearing on this topic today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize the Executive Director Wales to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Slotkin and Clark, Ranking Members Pfluger and Garbarino, and Chairman Thompson, for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I look forward to discussing CISA's efforts to elevate the nation's security and resilience against ransomware attacks. As you know, CISA is the National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience, responsible for reducing risk to digital and physical infrastructure that the American people rely on every hour of every day. Within the overall administration's approach to countering ransomware, we are focused on bolstering resilience. But unfortunately, strengthening resilience to withstand ransomware attacks is arguably the most difficult element of our collective efforts, as it ultimately relies on changing human behavior. And while certain steps, such as spotting phishing attempts, implementing multi-factor authentication, or patching vulnerabilities, are easily implemented at the individual level, they are much more difficult to implement community, business, or organization-wide. Building resilience requires a long-term investment in people, processes, and technology. Every organization that wants to avoid being a victim of ransomware must invest in the practices that will keep their customers, their systems, and their data protected. The question that we need to be asking ourselves is what we can do to have an impact now. I'd point to 3 things. First, we must give people the tools and guidance they need to increase their resilience and security. That is why CISA is working to raise awareness and promote basic cyber hygiene across tens of thousands of businesses and government agencies throughout the country. But CISA cannot raise our collective baseline of awareness and resilience alone, which is why CISA partners daily with other agencies, such as the FBI and the Secret Service, to evaluate threats and vulnerabilities, develop guidance, conduct outreach, and respond to incidents. For example, earlier this year, CISA and the Secret Service conducted a cyber incident response simulation workshop with state and local governments focused on ransomware. And as an example of a city taking full advantage of what DHS, CISA, and the Secret Service have to offer to manage ransomware risk, we have provided a sustained partnership in cybersecurity support to the City of Los Angeles and its 44 departments serving over 4 million residents in the form of cyber information sharing, threat training, assessments, and network defense services. The Los Angeles partnership is an example of what we can replicate across the nation. Additionally, earlier this summer, we led the interagency development and launch of StopRansomware.gov, the U.S. government's official repository for resources from across the interagency to help public and private organizations tackle ransomware more effectively. To date, StopRansomware.gov has had more than 455,000 page views, and our ransomware readiness assessment tool has been downloaded nearly 15,000 times. Second, because vulnerabilities are widespread across technology environments, it is increasingly challenging for organizations to prioritize which vulnerabilities to fix first. Last week, we released the binding operational directive, which established a dynamic CISA-managed catalog of more than 300 known exploited vulnerabilities and requires federal agencies to remediate such vulnerabilities within specific timeframes. While aimed at the federal government, we strongly encourage every organization to adopt this directive and prioritize mitigation of vulnerabilities listed in CISA's public catalog as we continually identify newly exploited vulnerabilities. And third, we must drive impact at scale if we hope to achieve the resilience we seek. Critical to that effort will be our partnerships with key players who can help us achieve broad-based effects. We recently launched the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, a partnership between key federal agencies and private sector companies who see across networks and industries to help us identify emerging threats, provide actionable information, and take action at scale to reduce the risk of compromises of all types. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, using our role to leverage expansive information sharing authorities to ensure early warning of threats and attacks. For example, just this morning, CISA, the FBI, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre released a joint cybersecurity advisory highlighting ongoing malicious activity associated with the government of Iran. We have observed that these actors exploit Fortinet and Microsoft Exchange proxy shell vulnerabilities to gain initial access to systems to advance follow-on operations, which include the deployment of ransomware. We urge critical infrastructure organizations to apply the recommendations listed in the advisory to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And while this advisory is based on an analysis of multiple incidents that CISA and the FBI supported, unfortunately today we receive information on only a fraction of incidents. This hampers our ability to conduct critical analysis, spot adversary campaigns, release mitigation guidance, and provide timely response, leaving critical infrastructure vulnerable. And that is unacceptable. Providing incident information to CISA and our federal partners quickly allows us to enrich it and get it out broadly, protecting future victims and raising the baseline of our nation's cybersecurity. I urge Congress to move quickly on the urgent priority of adopting incident notification legislation. In closing, our nation is facing unprecedented risk from cyber attacks undertaken by nation states and criminals. In response, and with your partnership and support, CISA will continue to lead our national call to action. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Assistant Director Sheridan to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Thompson, Chairwoman Clark, Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Member Garbarino, Ranking Member Pfluger, and members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the role of the Secret Service, the risk posed by ransomware, and our approach to countering this threat. I lead the Secret Service's investigative teams in our 160 global offices, which are combating transnational cybercrimes like ransomware. In fiscal year 2021, these investigative teams responded to over 700 network intrusions, prevented over $2 billion in financial losses, and returned over $54 million to victims through asset forfeitures. These outcomes illustrate one aspect of the Secret Service's role in managing risk and preventing crimes like ransomware. Since the agency's founding, our primary investigative mission is to safeguard the integrity of U.S. financial systems. While our protective mission implements measures to prevent harm to the persons, locations, and events we protect, including harm from cyber threats. We accomplish our integrated mission by working in close partnership with all levels of government and private organizations to effectively manage risk. For over 30 years, ransomware has been used to hold computers hostage and extort their users. Transnational cyber criminal networks using ransomware are enriched, emboldened, and expanding. These criminal networks are a persistent and growing threat, which we can best counter by driving down the profitability of their criminal schemes. This requires both improving the security and resilience of internet users and pursuing those that engage in or enable cyber crimes. Achieving this second aspect through criminal law enforcement is the specialty of the Secret Service. For 40 years, the Secret Service has investigated cyber crimes long before they were even called cyber crimes. While technology has rapidly evolved, our investigative approach has remained consistent. We follow the money. In doing so, we develop detailed evidence on transnational cybercrime networks. By working with our partners around the globe, we use this evidence to ensure the most significant criminals are apprehended and face justice. Extraditing cyber criminals to the U.S. disrupts, deters, and prevents future criminal activity. It has also resulted in reforming some experienced transnational criminals into assets in the fight against cybercrime. This is one reason why law enforcement action is an essential component to our national response to transnational cybercrime. Law enforcement investigations also provide additional benefits by developing indicators and warnings that we share with CISA and other partners to inform their actions. I see 3 priorities for law enforcement to aid in countering ransomware, all 3 of which would benefit from congressional action. First, reduce the profitability of ransomware campaigns by improving the ability of law enforcement to detect and interdict criminal crime proceeds. With the support of Congress, the Secret Service is making significant investments in the tools, training, and processes to empower our cyber fraud task forces to rapidly detect and seize the proceeds of cybercrime. Enacting the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 was a critical component in these efforts, but further legislative action could aid in ensuring we have the authorities and capabilities to most effectively combat the money laundering activity that is fueling the growth of transnational cybercrime. Second, law enforcement, particularly state and local law enforcement, act as first responders to ransomware. They are a part of our local communities and can respond quickest when called by those affected by ransomware. Since 2008, the Secret Service has developed the cyber investigative capabilities of our state and local partners by training and equipping them at the National Computer Forensics Institute. However, this critical program requires congressional reauthorization prior to September 2022 to ensure that training meets the growing demand. And third, we must dramatically intensify international law enforcement cooperation to investigate, arrest, and prosecute those engaged in transnational cybercrimes, including ransomware. The Secret Service is fortunate to have close and collaborative relationships with numerous law enforcement agencies around the world, from Europol to South Africa to Australia. These partnerships allow us to pursue transnational criminals, their associates, and their assets, wherever they may reside or travel to. These partnerships depend on continued congressional support for our international operations. In closing, I want to stress that ransomware is a threat to every community. It is being used to disrupt schools, city governments, local police departments, critical infrastructure, and other essential services, both here at home and abroad. Progress is possible, but requires a commitment to prioritize this issue both domestically and internationally as one of shared interest. I thank the committee for holding this important hearing and for your continued support of the U.S. Secret Service and our partners in countering cybercrime. I look forward to working closely with you and with other members of Congress on our shared priorities and welcome your questions.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind the subcommittees that we have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. So to the panelists, in June, the president laid down a very clear marker with Vladimir Putin that we will hold Russia responsible for stopping ransomware attacks coming out of its territory, regardless of who's committing them, against the 16 critical U.S. infrastructure sectors. The president noted that, quote, within the next 6 months to a year, we'd hope to see the impact of our engagement with Russia on cybersecurity. Given what we all just said, that Americans are on the front line when it comes to ransomware attacks, can you tell us, have we seen a change in the ransomware threat coming out of Russia, hitting U.S. critical infrastructure in the past 5 months? Have the attacks gone up, gone down, or stayed the same? Mr. Silvers.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We have been clear with Russia that actions will speak louder than words. On the trends, it's difficult to assess because the vast majority of ransomware incidents are not reported to the government. And so we are laser focused on getting the data, and we're doing that 2 ways. One, by enhancing our information sharing programs with the private sector so we can get more of it. And the second is by working very closely with Congress on the mandatory incident reporting bill that is being worked as part of the NDAA process, which would actually be transformative in this respect, in that it would get us the data we need to make these kinds of assessments that you expect to see in your oversight role.
Okay, so we're going to get the data, and I understand we need to get more data, but based on the data you have today in your hands, right, understanding it's imperfect, it's 5 months after a presidential summit, have you seen attacks go down, go up, or stay the same?
I can't make a definitive assessment at this time. As we've discussed in our conversations, Madam Chairwoman, you're correct that different experts have spoken different ways about what they've seen, and I think for that reason, it's important we get to ground on the data.
Okay, so we all work in jobs where we are evaluated based on our success or failure. What are the metrics that you can tell the American public in this committee that you will be using to determine whether attacks are going up or going down, whether Russia is taking action or not? Because it's one thing to say we're going to take action and to demonstrate strength. It's another thing to actually have the data to back it up. So a year from now, if you get all the things you want, what are the metrics that will help you evaluate whether things are going up or going down?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I think some of the metrics include number of ransomware strikes, and we are actively looking at sources to collect that from, including reporting to the federal government, but also working with, for example, private cybersecurity companies, with insurance companies who have a role in the ransomware payment ecosystem, with our monitoring of dark web forums that list ransomware activity. And through all that, we are pulling together what we believe are the best available data. The incident reporting bill will be truly transformative in helping us to do that. But I think 1 year out, we clearly will be much further along.
Okay, well, I would expect that 1 year out from that summit, we will be back here having that conversation with metrics to basically assess what has happened in the year since. If the United States knew that criminal actors were emanating from our soil and attacking another country, we would act, and I don't see any evidence that Russia is actually helping us on this score. Turning to a different subject, I was shocked last week, or 2 weeks ago, to have a bunch of superintendents from Michigan, K through 12 superintendents, come into my office. Every single one of them had been the victim of a ransomware attack. That means they had children's personal data in their hands, these attackers, and they had to pay the attackers in order to get them back, to get the personal data back. Folks like Ken Gutman, he's the superintendent of Walled Lake Consolidated Schools in Oakland County, a part of which I represent. 13,000 students were hit with this ransomware attack last October. Explain to the American public how their government helps them when that superintendent wakes up, his data has been ransomed, someone's asking for money. Who does he call? What does he do? What's the first move when that superintendent's been hit?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. This is a Main Street issue. It hits communities, and we have to have our services be accessible to communities so that people who are not incredibly sophisticated in these issues can be helped by them. That's why we created a one-stop website, stopransomware.gov, that state and local school districts, police departments, hospital systems can go to. They can find prevention advice so they can get ahead of it. They can also find response advice so that if they are hit, they know who to reach out to and can avail themselves of the services that CISA provides for response and that, for example, the Secret Service provides for investigating the crime.
Great. Sure, do you want to add something very, very briefly, because my time is expired
Sure,
here.
just very briefly. The most important thing that I would hope that you can convey within your districts to your constituents is the time to focus on ransomware is not after you've been hit. Because after you've been hit, your options are extremely, extremely limited. There is not a lot that anyone is going to be able to do that's going to be able to fix underlying problems. Some adversary already has your data in that environment. And that's going to be an extremely challenging situation for any organization, whether it's a government, a school district, or a business. The time to start focusing on ransomware is before. It's right now, today. What are the things they can do to make that eventuality less likely to happen?
Okay, thank you very much. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Pfluger, for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the discussion that we're having here today. I want to open up a discussion on the time to focus on this issue, the time to focus on preventing it, and I would like to say that I think that the most important piece of that is deterrence. And we have to have the technical capability, but we also have the political will to hold those accountable. And so I want to ask each of you just to respond whether or not, when you look at something that happened in the DC Metropolitan Police Department, where they were looking to extort the department, publish sensitive information about officers, including personal information, is this an act of terror? These are tactics that are commonly used. Is this a form of terrorism? Is it a crime? Are we getting into an act of war? What is y'all's, very quickly, because I want to explore this.
Mr. Chairman, it is most certainly a crime and a heinous crime, and one that is not just an ordinary crime, but also can raise to the national security level, I believe. And that is why I believe you've seen what is a national security response. And I agree on the importance of deterrence. And I want to make an important point, which is, and it also goes to Chairwoman Slotkin's question, we have been quite direct with the Russian government, but we are not sitting around and waiting for the Russian government to act. We have communicated that if they will not act against those taking this action from their territory, we will take those actions. And we are doing so. And those have been announced, and some have not been announced, in recent months, including cryptocurrency wallet seizures, indicting people, putting them on the run. And the noted cybersecurity expert Dmitry Alperovich has said that one of the keys here is to making ransomware criminals feel paranoid, scared, not trusting those around them. And that is what we are doing to disrupt.
And I think to Madam Chair's point, we need to see the metrics that tell us whether or not it's being taken seriously and having an effect. Mr. Wales, is this crime? Is it terror? Is it war? I mean, the Colonial Pipeline, had that been a kinetic weapon that was used on the Colonial Pipeline and the effects were the exact same, that would be an act of war in this country.
I think that's a little bit beyond CISA's purview, but I would certainly say that it is a national security imperative that we prevent any adversary from disrupting our critical infrastructure. And that's the kind of work that we're doing every day in partnership with our colleagues here at the table and elsewhere in government.
From CISA's perspective, do you see this as crime, terror, or otherwise?
I think crimes are dictated by statute, and my colleagues in the law enforcement community could probably tell you better than me what's a crime and what's not. But clearly, these are crimes. Clearly, they're designed to inflict terror on their victims because they are trying to extort money out of them. And the more that they could make their victims scared about what they're going to do with their information, or locking up their systems and jeopardizing their businesses or the organizations they manage, makes it more likely that a victim will pay. And I think, going to your earlier point, as long as ransomware is a viable tool to raise money, as long as they continue to be paid, people will continue to flock to this. So we may take some off the table, which we've done effectively, including in the last several weeks. new people will get into this because it continues to be a lucrative way of raising money, because it has become a matter of paying. Over the last several years, businesses have paid it as just a cost of doing business, and that has resulted in the epidemic that it is today. And
Mr.
as long as
Sheridan,
it's that
sorry
kind
to
of thing,
interrupt.
we're
We're
going to
limited on time. Mr. Sheridan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just expand on what my colleagues have said, sir. We are deterring criminal actors through prosecution, judicial action, and asset seizure, demonstrating that no one is beyond the reach of law. Metrics have been brought up multiple times. It's recognized we need better measurement for net assessment results, but we use some quantifiable metrics in the Secret Service. We've conducted over 937 arrests for cyber fraud activities. We prevented more than $2 billion in fraud loss. We've seized more than 3.5 million of financial accounts that have been used for illicit activities, seized $129 million, returned more than $55 million to victims. We do have quantifiable metrics in this space. They aren't universally applied across all law enforcement entities, but we are making impact, and I think those numbers demonstrate that in partnership with CISA, the FBI, and other law enforcement members.
Well, there's time. The time is now for a bold moment, and I think DHS needs to take the lead on this. And we need to have a discussion about what this is and how we deter. And I'm very concerned about whether or not we're actually able to hold people accountable inside Russia. And we want to see and hear and understand the specifics of those instances and how that effect is actually making headway to prevent our businesses. And I don't think it's limited to 16 categories. I think that any business, any industry, any person that is terrorized by these tactics and held hostage and then forced to make a payment to the benefit of a criminal organization, terrorist organization, or state actor is wrong. So we're looking for DHS to make a bold statement, to make recommendations to the president, and to then have that deterrent as rhetoric backed up with the technical capability to prevent this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair now recognizes Chairwoman Clark for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which provides $1 billion in grants to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to enhance their cyber defenses, was included recently in the recently enacted bipartisan infrastructure package. I introduced this legislation to give state and local governments the ability to defend themselves against cyber criminals who have been relentlessly attacking them. But funding alone is not enough. CISA must assist state and local governments in using this new funding and most effectively and efficiently. Mr. Wales, can you share with us about what CISA will be doing to ensure that funding is spent in ways that effectively address states' cyber risks and that we have a coordinated approach to enhancing state and local cybersecurity nationally?
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark, and I want to really thank you for your leadership on this. We believe that the cybersecurity grants for state and local communities is really going to be a game changer in dramatically enhancing the security of our communities throughout the country. Even before the bill was signed by the president, we had been working with FEMA to begin to map out what the plan is to roll these grants out over the next year. We, within CISA, are working to better identify what are the priorities that we want states and locals to focus on? What does the planning architecture need to look like for states as they develop their state cybersecurity plan? What are the priorities as that money flows down into local communities? And making sure that we are thinking through how do we get our CISA's field-based personnel ready to support state and locals as they begin to think about, plan, and implement the funding that will come along with these grants. I think up front,
So, Mr. Wells,
there's a lot of unevenness, and so
you,
it's a matter of getting everyone to a common baseline.
So, Mr. Wells, have you considered already cybersecurity improvements that you will encourage grantees to prioritize? And related to that, what to collaborations with the private sector? Are there any recent success stories that you can share?
Sure. So on the first question related to the early priorities. And I think a lot of those we hit on often, which is how do you get to a baseline level of cybersecurity? So how does a state put in place and a community put in place the right level of multi-factor authentication? How does it shrink the number of privileged accounts? How does it put in place a process to close vulnerabilities as soon as they're identified? Those type of cyber essentials will be kind of among the first priorities that we want states to invest in, and making sure that they have a workforce that's capable of supporting and sustaining that effort. When it comes to our relationship with the private sector, I would say that every day outputs that are coming from CISA are the result of our close partnership with the private sector. Even the recent cybersecurity advisories that we've released related to ransomware variants like DarkSide and Black Matter and Conti ransomware, those benefit from information that we share with the private sector, those key companies that have broad insight into the cybersecurity ecosystem who can provide us enrichment, and we can get that out to the entire country. In addition, I think if you look at a recent announcement from Palo Alto about the identification of critical infrastructure entities that were compromised because of vulnerabilities in Zoho Managed Engine, that was a result of information sharing from work that was done between the Coast Guard, the FBI, and CISA with our joint cyber defense collaborative partners. They then took that information, went and looked in their own system, and Palo Alto, one of our plank holder members of the JCDC, went and identified additional critical infrastructure victims and is able to remediate, now able to respond and remediate those vulnerabilities. We think that this partnership, both within the government and with the private sector, is beginning to pay really tremendous dividends. And it's not just partnership, it's this true operational collaboration.
Wonderful. As part of the broader cyber incident reporting legislation being considered in this year's NDAA, Congress is considering a requirement that entities report ransom payments to CISA. With an estimated 70 to 75% of the ransomware attacks currently unreported, this mandate would ensure the federal government has the information necessary to investigate ransomware cases and would allow for a better understanding of the scope and patterns of ransomware attacks across the country. Mr. Wells, how would CISA share the information gained through this mandatory reporting to enhance its own counter ransomware efforts?
Sure. So I think that when I think about what's in the legislation, there are two pieces of it. There's the actual cyber incident information that is going to be most useful for CISA. We will then take that information, working with our federal partners and with our critical infrastructure community, to get that information out in an anonymized way, to be able to spot broader campaigns and to protect future victims. The actual ransom payment information will be essential to our law enforcement community, the Secret Service, the FBI, and others who can actually take that information, investigate the criminal aspects of it, and potentially seize funds, trace the money, go after the perpetrators. Jeremy, I don't know if you've got additional points.
The woman's time, the Congresswoman's time has expired. Congressmember Garbarino.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wales, at the House Oversight hearing yesterday, you participated in, there was a significant amount of discussion regarding the mandatory cyber incident reporting bill in the NDAA. During the hearing, Mr. Vondran from the FBI said it was essential for FBI to receive full and immediate access to cyber incidents. We understand that the FBI plays an important role in investigating cybercrime and coordinating with CISA. However, as you know, Congress established CISA as the lead federal civilian cybersecurity agency with the authority to coordinate with the private sector, and the incident reporting legislation seeks to build on CISA's role. I'm eager to hear your thoughts, CISA's thoughts, on giving the FBI or Department of Justice a more central role in the incident reporting legislation being debated in Congress right now, and the importance of CISA's retaining its role as the lead federal civilian cyber agency.
I don't see, any of the changes that are being discussed changing CISA's fundamental role as the lead for civilian cyber defense when it comes to responding to incidents and supporting our critical infrastructure community. We have a tremendously close relationship with the FBI and the Department of Justice, and under any variation of this legislation, regardless of what is passed by Congress, we will work to ensure that FBI and our other law enforcement partners and our other federal agencies that need to have this information, whether it's Treasury or Department of Energy, they will get it as soon as possible. And we will work to ensure that on our end, as soon as the information comes in, it will get to the people who need the information. And in many respects, that's enshrining what we do today. CISA has not done on-site engagement with any victim that has not been fully coordinated with the FBI ahead of time. In almost all cases, that work is being done jointly today. And so we would really see this in the future as strengthening that partnership. We'll have more information for both CISA, the FBI, the Secret Service, and others when we engage with our critical infrastructure community.
Mr. Silvers, do you have anything to add to that, or?
I agree with Executive Director Wales.
Great, I appreciate that. Mr. Silvers, for you, on Monday, the DHS finally launched the Cybersecurity Talent Management System after it was authorized by Congress 7 years ago. While I appreciate this new system has significant potential to bring in the mission-critical cybersecurity experts that the department needs, it is not a silver bullet to solving the workforce challenges at DHS and CISA. I remain concerned that despite this innovative tool, the department and CISA still have onerous and duplicative vetting, elongated hiring timelines, and a lack of robust human resources organizations. Are you confident of the rollout of the cybersecurity talent management system will make a difference? And when do you expect to see tangible results?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranking Member. I am confident that the CTMS, as we're calling it, will achieve tangible results. I view the hiring challenges and the shortfall of cyber talent as a national security issue. And I think the CTMS is a critical component. I'm glad we rolled it out just a few days ago. It is not a silver bullet. We do need to streamline other human resources processes, security clearance processes, and otherwise throughout the department. Secretary Mayorkas has been cleared on that and is pursuing that as well. But I do believe that the CTMS will start to show tangible results over a period of months.
Great, and I've spoken to Director Easterly about this, and she's also very concerned. She has some ideas of where things can move along quicker, and she was excited about CTMS coming out as well. Mr. Wales, would you agree, or can you weigh in? You feel confident that, I was speaking to an organization of CISOs yesterday, and we discussed this and the pipeline, the employee pipeline for CISA and not having the proper people there right now. Can you weigh in on how CISA is going to?
Sure. So, I think CTMS is going to be a real powerful tool. Already, the stats I looked at this morning, we had 650 applicants across all grades and all specializations in CTMS have already put in applications into the new CTMS system. So we're now working to identify which of those candidates actually pass through the assessments and which ones can match up against job vacancies we have in the organization. So it really could be an extremely powerful tool that, as Undersecretary Silver says, over the next few months, we can start to see tangible results from it. That being said, we're not relying only on CTMS. We've been on full court press on hiring for the past year. Just in FY21, we've brought on more net gains in FY21 than in the previous 2 years combined, ×2. So really aggressive in kind of filling our billets, and at the same time, going to your point, and I mentioned this yesterday, we're looking at the kind of the full process to bring people on board and seeing what we can do internally to streamline it, and where we may need additional help from Congress. But right now, we don't think that's the case. But if and when that changes, we're happy to talk to you.
The gentleman.
I appreciate that very much. I want to thank you both for being here. And Mr. Sheridan, I'm just going to say your team in New York has been phenomenal with constituent cases. So keep up the good work. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Rhode Island has 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witness for your testimony today, for the job you're doing protecting the country. If I could start with Secretary Silvers. Secretary, I think part of our strategy for defending the country against ransomware needs to be focused on improving the security of the devices and technologies that we use. I see an opportunity for government-funded R&D in the space through critical technology security centers, a recommendation of the Cyberspace Alerting Commission, in which I served also as a commissioner. Congressman Gallagher and I actually adapted this idea into an amendment in this year's National Defense Authorization Act to create 4 such centers to evaluate and test the security of devices and technologies underpinning national critical functions. So, Secretary Silvers, I would be curious your thoughts on the merits of government-funded R&D to improve the security ecosystem, and whether you agree with the need for initiatives like critical technology security centers?
Thank you very much, Representative Langevin, and thank you for your leadership in the field of cybersecurity. I strongly agree in the importance of government-funded research and development in the field of cybersecurity, in particular, cybersecurity for critical technologies, national critical functions, and other areas where you can have national level impact from security vulnerability. I am aware of the Solarium Commission's support for that kind of funding, and I support that kind of funding as well. I know you are sponsoring legislation towards that end, and I would look forward to working with you on that legislation so that we can have the kind of robust research and development funding we need, which is done in part at the department's Science and Technology Directorate, which does an amazing job in this field.
Very good. Thank you for that. And continuing with you, if I could, Secretary, you spoke in your testimony about the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, JCDC, which I think is a hugely important initiative at the Department of Homeland Security. And in particular, I commend Director Easterly for her vision in wanting to create this, along with the rest of the team, yourself included. One of the key elements that I think should be housed within the larger JCDC superstructure is the Joint Collaborative Environment, which I work to include in the version of the National Defense Authorization Act that has passed the House already. The JCE would have would improve analysis of cyber threat indicators among public and private sector stakeholders, and in fact, having public stakeholders and private sector entities, especially in the areas of the most critical infrastructure, working side by side, seeing common threat information and such. So can you discuss the value of the Joint Collaborative Environment within the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative's broader mission, and the importance of ensuring participation from all relevant government stakeholders, including the intelligence community?
Thank you, Congressman. I do believe that if a Congress mandates the creation of a joint collaborative environment, that should be rolled up within the structure of the JCDC. We should be unifying efforts wherever possible. I also agree strongly that all elements of government that have a role to play should be included within those structures, so that we're not siloing our activity, but instead doing all the activity in a coordinated way.
Joe, including the intelligence community, obviously, is part of that.
That's correct, including the intelligence community.
Great, thank you. Last question I could for you, Secretary Silvers, is in thinking about how to defend the nation from ransomware, we really can't only be thinking only about the colonial pipelines of the world. Small businesses, local governments, and other community institutions also face serious threats from cyber criminals. How has DHS been approaching the problem of safeguarding these institutions against ransomware? Obviously, we've seen everything from police departments and hospitals and municipalities being affected, but if you could just take that question.
Thank you, Congressman. You're correct. Ransomware reaches right into our communities, including organizations that may not have a lot of cybersecurity resources or expertise. It is incumbent on us to make our expertise and resources accessible to those kinds of organizations like schools and hospitals and police departments. That's why we set up a one-stop ransomware website that those kinds of organizations can visit to get full spectrum support from the prevention side, which is critical because you've prevented from ever happening if you can engage the right kinds of best practices, all the way through to response and the support we can provide through law enforcement and through CISA in the event they are targeted.
Very good. Thank you. Well, I know my time's expired. I appreciate the work that you and the team at DHS are doing and to get CISA. And I'm sorry I didn't get to the other witnesses. Also valuable testimony you provided. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Of course.
That's my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Mr. Sheridan, I'd like to start with you. Our law enforcement performs an essential role in bolstering American cybersecurity by investigating a wide range of cyber crimes and apprehending and prosecuting those responsible. When it comes to fighting cybercrime, can you define the different roles between the Secret Service, the FBI, and HSI? How do you all work together collectively, and define the different roles for me?
Certainly. The Secret Service focus by statute is to protect the nation's financial infrastructure and financial payment systems. In our position, we utilize those statutes through our cyber fraud task forces located throughout the globe in order to focus primarily on payment systems, what affects the American public and the financial industry. For HSI, the focus is more on intellectual property, e-commerce, and counterfeit goods. And the FBI has a broader spectrum in terms of statutory authority that touches elements across the law enforcement community. I do think it's important that there is that overlap because cyber criminals do not specialize in one type of criminal activity that assigns itself to one statute in a very clear way. There must be overlap because ancillary crimes associated with cyber crimes that are used to facilitate the precipitating crimes, such as money laundering, human trafficking, and a full spectrum of other crimes, are required to employ other law enforcement entities in order to partner in that overall investigation.
I understand the different roles, but what I'm driving at here, and this issue, we see it come up time and time and time again, are having clear defined roles for all the entities that deal with this issue. And obviously, it's a complicated problem. We have to have different entities address it. But how those entities work together collectively and how the process is streamlined. Because for us, I talked about this a couple weeks ago. I have a business in my district that was held for ransom, had their data held with a ransomware attack for $900,000. And they call their insurers and their lawyers and the technical experts, and they tell them to pay. They get it down to $600,000. They said, I think we can get it down further. And he said, for heaven's sakes, we're losing a lot of money every day, a much bigger number than 600,000. And so they pay it. And I said, at any point did they ask you to reach out to anyone at the federal level? And they said no. And I think that's a big problem. And so I'm going to continue to talk about this because they said no because they didn't think that the federal government could help them in any way. They didn't think it was worth their time. And so how can those different roles, as defined as they are, how can you work together better?
I agree with you that that's a big problem, sir, and I'll answer that question in a couple different ways. First and foremost, we have formalized structures in place for information sharing through our cyber fraud task forces, through our role and presence in the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, through our role in the Joint Cyber Collaborative with CISA. And those are specifically designed to share information related to ongoing investigations. Secondly, in regards to the assessment that law enforcement can't help or the federal government can't help, I would challenge that conclusion. For us, investigation is prevention. By being brought in early in the investigative process, as was referenced earlier, there is an ability for us to identify the vulnerabilities that caused the intrusion or the unauthorized access. There is the ability to identify whether the adversary is still present in the network. Our role is to assist the organization to become whole again, to resume business operations, and of course, to be able to enact justice against those perpetrating the crime. Not only that, but we have mechanisms in place through financial institutions and partnerships in order to obtain illicit funds that are in transit or going to criminal accounts, criminal wallets, criminal...
I want to get to one more question.
Go ahead, sir.
For the others. I would disagree with it too, but I think you'd agree with the point that we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, sir.
To be better and to change the perception. Mr. Silvers and Mr. Wales, if you'd quickly comment, this committee has been very focused on the various roles and responsibilities in the federal government cyber mission, particularly among the roles of the DHS Secretary, Director of CISA, and the National Cyber Director. From your perspective, in DHS policy, what additional work needs to be done to ensure we have clear lines of roles and responsibilities so that we can avoid missteps like we saw in the federal government's response to the attacks on Colonial Pipeline? You have to be really quick.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I think actually we are working quite well together, especially since the recent creation of the National Cyber Director Office. And I think what it's about is teamwork. We bring different authorities to bear, but it's about being on the same page, working together and with arms linked. And I think we're doing that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I assume you mean this gentleman from New Jersey.
Exactly right. Congressmember Malinowski.
Thank you. Well, thanks to the witnesses. I know we're talking about defense of the homeland here, but I do want to turn our attention to the obvious fact that the ransomware gangs that have been wreaking this havoc are not based in Chicago or LA or New York or in England or in France. They're based in safe havens in countries where governments are either unable or, I think, more likely unwilling to confront them. And I wanted to ask our witnesses a couple of questions about that. First of all, of course, we know that a number of these operators have been working out of Russia and countries that are under the influence of the Russian government. And I wanted to ask any of the witnesses whether you have seen any changes in the operations of these groups or the efforts of governments in Russia and in that neighborhood to crack down on them since President Biden issued some fairly direct warnings to President Putin at their summit in the early summer.
Thank you, Congressman Malinowski, for the question. We've been clear with Russia that actions are going to speak louder than words. And with respect to your question about the trend, it's quite difficult to assess after a period of just a few months because the vast majority of ransomware incidents are not reported to the federal government. And so our focus is on accelerating our ability to collect and get at that kind of data so we can deliver those kinds of assessments to you. We're doing that two ways. One, through enhanced information sharing programs with the private sector. We're doing that with private cybersecurity companies, the insurance industry, and others that have a role in the ransomware ecosystem. And we're also doing that by working with Congress on the mandatory incident reporting legislation that is currently being part of the NDAA process, and which would candidly be transformative and groundbreaking in terms of our ability to get that kind of data as to incidents, as to ransomware payments that are made, so that we can provide better clarity on the trend lines.
That makes sense, and I strongly support that provision. But just to be clear, are you saying that absent mandatory reporting, we really have no way of knowing whether the warnings that we have issued, the efforts, public and private, that have been made to persuade those governments to crack down are working? I mean, surely we must have some visibility into that.
It's incomplete, but we do have some data, and it's more anecdotal, and we work with what we have. And I want to be clear, Representative Malinowski, that we are not sitting and waiting for Russia to act. We've communicated that we expect them to act, but if they will not, we will take action against those perpetrating ransomware from their territory. And I think that's exactly what we've seen in recent months, as we have announced as an administration recent groundbreaking and innovative enforcement actions to seize cryptocurrency proceeds, seize cryptocurrency wallets, sanction cryptocurrency exchanges used by ransomware actors for the first time, and indict and sanction individuals.
No, and I applaud that, and it's fantastic work you're doing. But obviously, Putin could shut these operations down in a day if he wanted to. So this is why I focus on that. And frankly, although we don't talk about this as much publicly, I do believe that there's an offensive, not just defensive capability that we need to be employing here. And then finally, I've asked these questions about Russia and the former sort of Soviet countries, but isn't it also the case that we're seeing an emergence of ransomware groups in other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example? And if so, what are we doing working with allies in those regions to share best practices and strengthen enforcement?
That's very much correct, Congressman. We do see ransomware emanating from a variety of different countries, and that is why one of the most important pillars of this administration's ransomware strategy has been a diplomatic effort to link arms. Recently, the White House convened over 30 participating like-minded countries to rally support for the battle against ransomware. That includes law enforcement investigation cooperation. It means reaching the arm of the law to those places, building capacity for countries that might not have the capacity or the awareness so that we can bring more of these people to justice. That is exactly what we are doing with the Secret Service and other partners.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from
Thank you.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, in your joint written testimony on page 1, you list out various organizations that have been impacted by ransomware. The list contains hospitals, municipal governments, schools, police departments, other essential businesses. And then you go further and you talk about some of the impacts that we've seen just within the last year of ransomware. You talk about Colonial Pipeline and the impact that it had on gas supplies and therefore gas prices. We talk about JBS and the impact that that had on food prices. And we know that ransomware attacks and cyber attacks in general are becoming more widespread, more prevalent in today's society. And then today we're talking about a whole of government approach, what we can do, all levels of government, state, local, federal, working together. In my home state of Mississippi, we've established a cyber working group. And then within that cyber working group, you have not only state, federal, and local law enforcement. It encompasses the private sector. It includes our academic universities. And also includes the Department of Defense and our Mississippi National Guard. And so my question to any of you or to the panel as a whole is, can you talk a little bit and speak of the importance of these types of partnerships that we are seeking to put together in states across the union and the impact that they will have on combating cyber threats?
I think that those kind of working groups are essential, and actually they're going to be a key part of the implementation of the cybersecurity grant program that was recently approved as part of the infrastructure bill. Each state is going to have to create or take an existing working group, like Mississippi may already have used the one that they've already created, make sure that there's adequate representation of the right organizations, of the right people at both the state and the local level that are going to help shape the implementation of those grants and help to focus where those go. They're going to approve the plans that are required for each state that need to be developed before the grants will be allocated. And so, and we are actively involved in a number of the cyber working groups across this country using the field-based CISA personnel, the cybersecurity advisors, and the state cybersecurity coordinators that we have out there that are designed to be that linkage between the state and local community and the broader CISA services that we offer from headquarters.
Ms. Silver, let me touch on something that you brought up just a minute ago in one of your answers to Representative Malinowski's question. You talked about it, and it is also contained in the written testimony about the Department of Treasury's recent announcement of sanctions on a Russian-based cryptocurrency exchange that was involved in transaction involving illegal proceeds from various ransomware attacks. I've actually pulled the press release that the Treasury Department issued, and it said that this particular exchange, that transactions showed that up to 40% of the known transactions were associated with illicit actors. Can you speak a little bit about those sanctions that were imposed and the role that not just this particular currency exchange, but some other currency exchanges are playing in what we're seeing as the ransomware attacks that are happening across the country?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a really important question. There's just no question that the rise of ransomware has been fueled by the availability of cryptocurrencies that allow for anonymized payments. And that presents enormous challenges for law enforcement, for example. But what we have determined is that there are certain exchanges that are really being used by these threat actors because they are not governed and they don't have the kinds of financial regulatory controls that we expect to see in our financial system. And so we have not hesitated as an administration to take action against those kinds of exchanges. And in fact, Treasury has sanctioned 2 cryptocurrency platforms in recent months. That's the first time that cryptocurrency exchanges have been subject to sanctions. I expect to see a lot more activity, a lot more aggressive, disruptive action. For example, we have recently, as an administration, also seized cryptocurrency wallets, actually seized the Bitcoin or other digital tokens that are used as ransomware proceeds. So we are taking the fight and going after these people's money.
And just one last follow-up, my time is almost up. I know that the first cryptocurrency exchange that was sanctioned was in Russia. Where was the second one located, if you know?
It's also Russia.
Both Russia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Silvers, I want to follow up on the questions that were asked regarding Russia from Congressmembers Slotkin and Malinowski. The United States has said that it will no longer tolerate Russia's safe harbor for ransomware attacks on the 16 areas of critical infrastructure. Is that correct? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
The implication is that we will tolerate Russia's safe harbor for ransomware attacks on individuals and institutions that fall outside the 16 areas of critical infrastructure. You know, we would never make that distinction in the physical realm. Why should we make that distinction in the digital realm? Like, is that the policy of the United States, or?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think the policy of the United States is that any act of ransomware is a crime and will be investigated and prosecuted. The direct.
I'm referring to Russia, not to the particular criminal actors. Are there consequences to Russia for a Russian safe harbor for ransomware attacks on non-critical infrastructure? Yes or no?
Mr. Chairman, the direct discussions, and there have been some very direct discussions, are being led by the National Security Council directly with the Russians, and I would defer to them on the content of those discussions.
And I want to go back to, I understand that there's a lack of data, but there's been a lack of reporting for years. But we have enough knowledge to know that ransomware has been growing exponentially over the course of several years. Have you seen, among reported incidents, have you seen an increase in activity?
At this point, I can't give a confident assessment in the short period of time since then.
Even among the incidents that have been reported to you?
Congressman Torres, we have seen experts who have spoken about it both ways.
No, I'm referring to you. You have received reports about ransomware. Have you seen an increase or a decrease? It's a straightforward question.
I would defer to colleagues from CISA and the Secret Service as to the types of reports they've gotten and whether there's a trend in the data that they can see.
What I would say is, and the Assistant Director for the FBI made this clear yesterday, based upon the reporting that has been made to the federal government, at this time we've not seen a change in the amount of ransomware being targeted against.
So it remains the same?
Yes.
So there's no evidence that Russia is keeping its promise?
That's a broad answer in terms of all ransomware.
Well, if nothing's changed, I would treat it. Why I would ask this: Do cyber criminal organizations continue to operate disproportionately in Russia, based on the intelligence that you have? And do those organizations continue to be active?
Congressman, if we have a list of countries that have a more tolerant or offer safe harbor, and in some cases offer outright support to cyber criminals, Russia is one of those countries. So if your question is, does Russia tolerate this? As a general answer, the answer is yes.
And those organizations, to your knowledge, remain active?
Yes, sir.
And we've seen no, based on reported incidents, we've seen no decrease. It seems to me that Russia has broken its promise to the United States. But I'm going to move on. You know, we've known for a long time that cyber criminals can exploit the anonymous or pseudonymous nature of crypto for ransom payments. But we know from the experience of Colonial Pipeline that law enforcement, particularly the FBI, can exploit the transparency of blockchain for ransom recovery. The FBI, it has been reported, recovered most of the $4.4 million ransom that Colonial Pipeline paid. Does the Secret Service and DHSI, does the Secret Service have the same technical capacity to exploit the transparency of blockchain for ransom recovery?
Yes, sir. I would say that blockchain by its very nature is transparent. The reason I can't comment on the actual investigative techniques used for that seizure, but that reason for that seizure was not solely technical in nature. There was intelligence components involved.
Do you think with enough technical expertise and enough public investment, we could make ransom recovery the rule rather than the exception? Or is it prohibitively intensive and expensive?
That's a great question. I think we could certainly be more proficient in it. The Secret Service is, employs a host of computer scientists, blockchain analysts, crypto tracers who are very adept at that exact activity. But we need to get better. We need to expand our staffing. We need to increase our foreign presence. We need to have greater technical capability in this arena. And we can certainly seize more of it if it becomes the rule. That's really hard to assess, sir.
And I'll ask one question. Ransomware, the rise of ransomware has multiple causes. There's ransomware as a service, Russia and Eastern Europe as a safe harbor, the anonymous and pseudonymous nature of crypto, the lack of cyber hygiene. Suppose each of you had a magic wand. Which of these causes would you make disappear in order to dramatically reduce ransomware in the United States? I'll start with Mr. Silvers, and that will be my final question.
That's a great question, Congressman. I think the rise of affiliate networks, the ransomware as a service, where unrelated hackers can come together with a ransomware developer to execute a strike, has really sharply escalated the volume that's hitting at us. And so I think disrupting that network, it would be critical, and maybe I would choose that one. And I think that is what we're doing as an administration by making ransomware actors feel like they cannot trust their partners.
And I just want to Mr. Wales and Mr. Sheridan quickly, and then I have to move on to the next questioner.
Well, I'll stay on brand for CISA. If everyone adopted basic cyber hygiene, implemented multi-factor authentication, we would dramatically shrink the universe of.
So ransomware as service, cyber hygiene, what's the cause you would make magically disappear?
Partnerships with law enforcement. We need better information, better intelligence, and better communication in order to respond to these incidents.
I appreciate the answers. My time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our distinguished witnesses for your testimony and answering our questions here today. Obviously, this is a critical subject that we've had prior hearings on, and I think I had the opportunity, Mr. Sheridan, to speak last time on the very same subject that Mr. Torres was asking about, the ransomware utilization of cryptocurrency, and in specific, my continuing concern around the use of altcoins as a way of pumping and dumping to transfer revenue. But I wanted to ask a bit more specifically, and I believe we may have another member not on mute, just if that member could mute. But we have seen foreign adversaries and bad actors exploiting US-based platforms in order to conduct these cyber attacks to circumvent US intelligence community restrictions. Individual components that may have restrictions based on domestic-based platforms relative to international, that US persons carve out. What more can the federal government do to prevent foreign entities, whether it's a state actor or a non-state actor, from doing an end run around some of these protections that we have so that our intelligence community is not domestic focused? What can we do to make sure that that is not being exploited for the purposes of cyber crime and specifically ransomware?
I'll start, and there may be additional answers here. I think the U.S. government is coming at this primarily from two angles. One is there was an executive order signed by President Trump in the waning days of the administration that was focused on improving the work with those infrastructure as a service providers, those virtual private networks and other cloud providers, requiring them to do more kind of, let's just shorthanded with kind of know your customer. So improved due diligence when they are leasing their infrastructure to particularly foreign accounts, having more due diligence on that, and there's some work with the federal government there. And then second, the work that we are doing with the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, bringing together those companies that operate this kind of global cloud infrastructure and who have broad visibility, making sure that we've got a good partnership between the federal government and what we know from the intelligence community, what we know from law enforcement, what we know from our network defense work and what they can see inside of their networks, the more that we can arm them, the more work that they can do inside of their networks to protect their customers or prevent their network from being used to being weaponized against other potential victims. So that's part of the answer. Obviously, there's no perfect solution. This is going to require more thought and more engagement.
And I would say from a law enforcement perspective, increasing staffing and infrastructure in foreign locations, also compelling foreign exchangers and service providers to respond and provide information when we have evidence of crimes being committed, increase accountability for ISPs hosting malicious infrastructure or other elements of criminal activity, and allowing legal process for suspects identified in non-extraditable or non-friendly countries that are willing to cooperate with U.S. law enforcement. There are still obstacles for us to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Sheridan. That actually feeds very well into my next question, which was to Mr. Silvers. Can you speak a little bit more how DHS may be utilizing deterrence on the ransomware side, right? Obviously, on CISA, there's a strong emphasis on building up resilience, on some of that basic cyber hygiene, on tracking the flows afterwards in conjunction with the FBI or Secret Service. But can you speak to what initiatives or efforts DHS is trying to engage on the deterrence side to try to prevent particularly non-state, but state actors as well from engaging in ransomware?
Thank you very much, Congressman Meyer. Absolutely, a critical component of this is defense, but also going on offense and really disrupting and candidly scaring the ransomware actors who are doing this so that they take their business elsewhere. And I think a key component of that is law enforcement investigation, of course. We, as an administration, are also pursuing some very novel actions in terms of cryptocurrency seizures, sanctioning of cryptocurrency exchanges that are being used by these actors, as well as other activities that we wouldn't discuss in an open session like this. So we agree, and we are being aggressive.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that, Mr. Silvers. And I think you'll find full support on having a panoply of options here, from the offensive to the defensive to the preventative. But with that, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I believe I'm almost in a ransomware experience now in the House of Representatives in the Rayburn building. Forgive me for the coloration of where I am. I'm almost in complete darkness, which makes this meeting and hearing more potent than I might have imagined. Let me pose a question that I hope that the members will delve into extensively. And I will say that I am an author of original zero-day legislation that has been modified to our current set of circumstances, but I do believe that this hearing speaks to that potential, dealing with the whole of government approach combating ransomware. Let me, in the UK, there is a report that 60% of organizations have been hit by a ransomware as a service attacks in the past 18 months. Ransomware as a service attacks are where one group builds a malicious code and sells it to another group to use in the virtual breaking and entering of a vulnerable enterprise organization. Just a regular successful business. This may be an attempt for groups to create more activity to make it more difficult to find the more malicious and dangerous ransomware attackers. Gentlemen, if you would answer, is the United States doing enough to collaborate with other governments to track and disrupt this sort of increasing business source of ransomware attack tools out on the marketplace? Are we seeing attacks of this nature in the United States? Is this something that is attractive and that can become very alarming? If each of you would answer, starting with Mr. Silvers, and then Mr. Wales, and Mr. Sheridan. And thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity in the midst of darkness to ask these questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I appreciate the question, and to your point about the importance of international collaboration in combating ransomware, we could not agree more strongly. That is why we have really formed a coalition of the willing of like-minded countries. We assembled over 30 of them at the White House very recently on a joint global initiative of responsible countries to combat this. That's going to take the form of joint cybercrime investigations, sharing of cyber threat intelligence across borders, and joint actions to disrupt these criminals wherever they may operate. We couldn't agree more on the importance of the diplomatic component of this, and we are on it.
Thank you. Mr. Wells, you want to speak to the idea of ransom as we go type efforts? Thank you.
No, and I think your point is right. The rise of ransomware as a service is one of the, and this goes to Congressman Torres's point earlier, it's one of the factors that has driven the acceleration of ransomware attacks because it has lowered the barrier to entry. I do not need to be as sophisticated a cyber actor if I can just rent someone else's service and use that to launch attacks. I don't need to have the depth of technical knowledge and expertise in order to utilize ransomware as a service platforms. And so it has featured prominently in a number of the more significant attacks on the homeland that we've seen over the past year are driven by these what are called affiliates that utilize ransomware as a service variants. And I think it is because of that, it has helped to sharpen the strategy we have to really go after, from a law enforcement perspective, working with our international partners, the central hubs, so the people who actually are ones who are designing the ransomware as a service platforms, because disrupting them can have a more pervasive effect on the ransomware ecosystem.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah,
Next.
yes,
witness,
ma'am.
please.
Just to conclude, we have 19 foreign offices located around the globe. We partner with Interpol, Europol, European Cyber Crime Center, and other international law enforcement partners to combat this threat. As stated by my colleagues, this is a transnational organized problem that is being committed by really a small cadre who are operating, organizing, and supporting the most significant cases that we're seeing. The ransomware actors that are the affiliates that Mr. Wales referenced are really the street-level thugs, to use a interpersonal crime metaphor. What we're trying to target are the Steve Jobs or the Bill Gates of these organizations. Our biggest challenges are the organized networks that have extensive leadership, levels of trust, and very complicated organizational structures. And we target, investigate, extradite, and prosecute the top-tier criminals in those organizations. We target the networks, not just the individuals or the variants, that allow financially motivated cyber criminals to operate with impunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman, and I look forward to a legislative response to some of the concerns that have been raised by my question and some of the answers that have been given. Thank you so very much. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. I want to enter into the record testimony from Security Scorecard entitled Using Machine Learning to Assess Ransomware Risk. With that, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittees may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the subcommittee's record will remain open for 10 business days. Without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.